Hello, I'm Jack Kaiser with Progressive Voices. I'm here as part of our ongoing dialogue about school financing in Wisconsin, and in particular the western Wisconsin. It occurs to us that it's imperative that we get some basic concepts down before we go forth, because we take it for granted sometime that everybody knows all the words and terms, etc. To that extent, I'm sitting here with Chad Trowbridge, the Business Services Manager of the Chippewa Falls Area Unified School District, to define some of the concepts of school financing in Wisconsin. Welcome, Chad.
Thank you, Jack. I appreciate you having me today.
Well, let's get right down to it. Where does the bulk of revenue for a Wisconsin school district come from?
About 95% of school revenues come from two sources, state aid and property taxes.
And how is the state aid determined?
It's based upon your prior year expenditure level and your property value per student. So if a school district has a moderate spending level per student as compared to state averages and a low student population, or a low property value per student, they would have a higher percentage of state aid. If they have a high property value per student, odds are they would have a lower state aid figure.
As one side of that fraction goes up or down, the ultimate state aid is affected directly, correct?
Correct.
What makes up for the revenue that's not covered by state aid?
The higher your state aid, the lower your property taxes. And the lower your state aid, the higher your property taxes. And those are determined by a school district's revenue limit.
By way of example, using the Chippewa Falls Area Unified School District numbers for last year, give us an example of how much comes from state aid and how much comes from the property taxpayer.
Our revenue limit generates about $50 million. So in our prior school year, about $28 million of that came from state aid, and about $22 million of that came from property taxes.
What is a revenue cap?
That's a good question. Revenue caps were imposed on school districts in 1993. And at the time, basically, they took the expenditure level per student at that point in time and have affixed that to only be able to grow by a rise in student population or a proportionate inflationary increase to the revenue limit. So really, in simplistic terms, it's the amount of money you spend per student times any kind of inflationary increase that develops the maximum amount of money you can generate from state aid and property taxes.
And what was the policy behind the legislative action in 1993 to impose revenue caps?
But the idea behind it was property tax relief. So at the time, the state committed to 2/3 funding of Wisconsin public schools. So the idea behind that is the more the state would pay, the less that school districts would have to levy from their property taxpayers.
I understand there are three types of school referendums a voter might see on a ballot. Is that right?
That's correct.
What's the most common?
The most common is a referendum for debt issue or bonding. That is a borrowing for a period of time, generally anywhere from 5 to 20 years. And we'd mostly see those for areas of capital improvements or construction of new facilities or renovations. So generally speaking, most of those are related to buildings.
In almost all cases where a school district wants to incur debt, be it through bonding or notes or so forth, must it go before the voters in a referendum?
Yes, there are a couple exceptions to that, but they're not very widely used.
Now, I understand that there are two other types of referendum which both get at asking the voters for authority to exceed the revenue caps. Is that right?
That's correct. There are two. One is called recurring. Just like it sounds, it's able to happen over and over again for a period of time. And the other is called non-recurring. So basically, that's a one-time type expense that a district is asking for additional dollars to fund something.
Basically, on a recurring basis, the school district is posing the question to the electorate, will you allow us to exceed our revenue caps for a certain period of time?
Correct. And generally, the reason for that for a school district is expenses have kind of outpaced, from an inflationary perspective, where their revenues are coming into play. Most often you see that in a school district that has some declining enrollment. So as an example, if you're in a school district that has one first grade and there are 25 kids in that classroom one year and only 15 in that classroom the following year, it doesn't negate the need for a first grade teacher, but there's a despairing amount of difference between the amount of revenue that can be generated per pupil based on that class size.
So these sorts of referendum become important to school districts who have rapidly declining enrollment.
Correct. So what they're asking for is permission to exceed the revenue cap to sustain their programs.
Have those been used commonly in western Wisconsin?
Western Wisconsin is an area of the state that has seen a considerable amount of declining enrollment, so they have become more prevalent in this part of the state. A number of years ago, when they were first being approached, generally schools were asking for X amount of dollars for an unlimited amount of years. Those didn't have a very high success rate, so generally in the past we've seen those anywhere from 1 to 5 years, where it's a specific dollar amount per year for 5 years. Then at the end of that 5 years, they would reassess the need for that additional revenue and adjust and go back to another referendum, or perhaps they've seen some enrollment gain and would no longer need that additional revenue, but they would make that determination at that point in time. And then taxpayers are approving that for a specific period of time.
Give us an example of a non-recurring referendum.
Non-recurring referendum are not very common, but a couple examples that I might come up with is, let's say you have a technology integration initiative, and you would just need, it could be a large or a small amount of dollar, but it doesn't really necessitate the need for a long-term borrowing. If you can get a one-time property tax levy increase to fund a specific program, like some kind of computer initiative. It's common now to see kids carrying a laptop computer with them. It's referred to as a one-to-one scenario. Maybe there's some capital equipment needs that you would need to borrow. You need to exceed the revenue cap to get that technology in the hands of students. Another one that we've seen in this part of the state, 4-year-old kindergarten is a growing program throughout the state of Wisconsin. So in this area over the past 10 years, a number of districts have started 4-year-old kindergarten. And because you wouldn't get state aid on that program until the following year, oftentimes districts are asking for their taxpayers for startup costs to fund staffing and transportation and curriculum that goes along with 4-year-old kindergarten programming.
Well, what you've told me has clarified things for me, and I surely hope it clarifies things for the viewer. Thanks for being here, Chad.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.